Hello, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today. My name is Elsa Falkenberger. I'm a Principal Research Associate, and I co-lead the Community Engaged Methods Group at Urban. I'm pleased to welcome you to the third discussion in our week-long series on the equity imperative. I'd like to thank all of our panelists and audience members for taking the time to join us today. This has been a very heavy week, and we hope that our discussion today provides you with ideas and inspiration for proactively contributing to solutions to inequities in your city. I would also like to thank Mastercard Center for Inclusive Growth for their collaboration in today's event, this week's series, and the Accelerating Innovation for Inclusion initiative. Over the past year, support from the Mastercard Impact Fund has enabled Urban to conduct research projects focused on the ways in which technology is transforming local government systems and services, and how these technologies might help cities achieve equity goals, or maybe exacerbating existing inequities. In yesterday's event, we discussed how local governments can partner with private companies to leverage technology for public interest and develop services and processes to meet community needs. The panelists shared thoughts and ideas on how to ensure mutual accountability between governments and companies advancing new technologies. We also heard from the leaders from Kansas City on how they put this into practice. Today, we will discuss what community engagement looks like in practice, placing resident voices at the forefront to ensure innovative technology policies are inclusive and more effective. Ensuring these voices are heard is an important tenet within the Community Engaged Methods Group here at Urban. Community Engaged Methods refers to a rigorous research methodology that includes the input, participation, and reflections of the people and communities at the heart of the issues we study. We have evidence that this approach leads to more effective and sustainable policies and practices. As such, urban researchers are increasingly engaging the community to strengthen research designs, advance equity and inclusion, and improve policy impact. The pandemic has disrupted traditional methods of engagement due to the need of practice social distancing. Our discussion today will highlight effective community engagement strategies in this moment and explain how cities, nonprofits, and communities are adapting. Before we begin, I'd like to go through a few housekeeping items. First, I want to mention that this event is being recorded and that the recording will be posted online afterwards. All participants are muted during the event. Please type your questions or comments into the Q&A box at any time, and we'll get to them at the end. You're also welcome to comment or upvote on any questions that others send. Lastly, we encourage you to interact with us online using hashtag #InnovateForInclusiveGrowth today and throughout this week's events. Now I'm happy to introduce my colleague, Dr. Richard Ezeki, who will introduce our panel conversation. Richard is an engineer, a community servant, and a researcher who employs his expertise to engage the community on issues related to environmental protection, transportation equity, and STEAM advocacy, science, technology, engineering, arts, and math. He is currently at the Urban Institute as a senior policy associate in the Research to Action Lab, where he manages a directive to ensure innovative technologies are accessible and inclusive of all communities. All yours, Richard.
Thank you for that introduction, Elsa. And I'd like for our three panelists to join us on video, and then we shall proceed with introductions. Great. Okay, great. All right, so to begin, I would like to start the session by inviting each of our panelists to introduce themselves and just give their name, title, and their role and responsibilities. So first, I'll start with Noel Hidalgo. Noel.
Hello, my name is Noel or Noel. I'm a Gemini. I love my two names. I'm the executive director of Beta NYC, and Beta NYC is a small civic tech nonprofit in New York City.
Thank you, Noel. Now let's go to Dan. Dan.
Hi, Dan Lurie, Chief of Policy to Mayor Lightfoot in Chicago. My video seems to not be working, which is on my end, so I'm going to try to fix it, but I'm on audio for now.
Thank you, Dan. And Chelsea?
I'm Chelsea Malden. I'm the Executive Director of the Public Policy Lab, or a nonprofit based in New York City that helps cities design better policy and social services with residents.
Thank you very much for the introductions. So today, we will be talking about the significance of engaging residents early and incorporating their feedback into planning processes with equity in mind. At yesterday's sessions on public-private partnerships, we heard that technology needs to be designed with the community and not for it. How cities need to listen to the community to hear what's happening and make sure that they can respond, and how the community should clearly express the desired outcomes they want to see with city leaders. These are very relevant points leading into today's discussion. If a city seeks to have inclusivity as a top priority, it needs to put the voices of its residents at the forefront. However, as mentioned earlier by Elsa, the strategies for community engagement are shifting due to the pandemic. Traditional methods of engagement, such as having in-person meetings, doing information sessions at large events, are made difficult due to the need to practice social distancing. So in this panel, we have a great panel in store, and we look forward to hearing their comments on the following questions. Let's get started. So the first question I would like to ask to our panelists, and each of you would please respond. Why is community engagement valuable, and why should residents be involved early in any decision-making process? Actually, let's start with you, Noel, and then we'll go through the panel.
Sure. So why is community voices important? The first and the most important part is that we live in a democracy, or at least we claim to live in a democracy that is predicated upon the voices of the people. And so, historically, a selection of that representative democracy is able to vote in November. And sometimes those decisions aren't even made in November. They're made months before that in a primary process and through a very hyper-political process. And so we need to make sure that government is inclusive of all voices, regardless of the capability of being able to cast a ballot and vote. And so democracy, true democracy, should have a continuous setup and a continuous framework where it's doing active listening across all spectrums, across all various projects, and it's continuous. It doesn't just happen in November. It just doesn't happen on an election day. It doesn't get seeded over to elected officials. It is a perpetual process where the members of that community of all capabilities have an opportunity to weigh in. And hopefully government essentially sits as the arbiter and recognizes that some members of the community have a unique bias and have an ability with greater sway, and helps level the playing field, so that way the marginalized members of community have the ability to say their piece and have the opportunity to speak up and do collective planning, so that way we can all live in the communities that we want to live in.
Thank you, Noel. Chelsea, I'd like to also have you share your thoughts.
Sure. So my background is as a social scientist and a designer, and I'll speak to this perhaps from a design perspective. What designers do is try to invent things that have useful functions or meet the requirements or constraints of a particular design brief. And what we see often is that the policymakers with whom we partner have, a genuine desire to be helpful and to use public resources to serve public needs and to respond to the desires and aspirations of their communities. But how is a policymaker supposed to actually know what community members want or desire or imagine without engaging substantively with those community members themselves? We put too much of a burden on policymakers to be able to inhabit the needs and aspirations of communities when we don't engage in meaningful and substantive community design processes. So we would always argue as designers that a way to find out what people need and want is actually to just ask them what their experiences are and to engage with them around co-creating solutions that serve their needs and their contexts. That's what policymakers can do when they have really meaningful community engagement, as opposed to some of the more rote forms of community engagement that we see, where policymakers essentially inform communities about their intentions, but don't seek to have their own minds changed, don't seek to have policies and services altered because of the requirements that community members describe or define.
Mm-hmm. Very relevant. Thank you, Chelsea. And And Dan, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this question as well.
Yeah, I guess I'd just echo what everyone has said prior to me. I think effectiveness and legitimacy. I mean, that's to the person before me, that the question of what is the problem we're trying to solve, and how that fundamental question is something that cannot be done unilaterally. I think in terms of legitimacy, whatever relationship does or doesn't exist between government and resident, it has to come from a foundation of trust and legitimacy, or well, I think the consequences are obvious. And then in terms of effectiveness, we have to have a feedback loop. We have to have a two-way street. We have well-intentioned design efforts that don't actually help people because they're not reaching them, they're not understood, they're not made accessible for a whole host of reasons, or they lead to unintended consequences, like I'd say the majority of our domestic policy is playing out with. So yeah, so for those reasons, I'd echo what my colleagues, my peers have said.
Thank you for your comments, Dan. Very much appreciated. Okay, so going to our next question. The coronavirus has changed how cities engage with residents. As in-person meetings have been effectively banned due to social distancing, engagement online has increased. As part of our work here at Urban, we conducted a survey of city technology and innovation personnel, and that showed that video conferencing and social media are being increasingly used by residents. So Dan, I wanted to first direct this question to you. Can you discuss how residents in Chicago are shifting their online behavior during the pandemic, and how they're doing that, and how cities should adapt to maintain robust engagement?
So let me make sure I understand. The first question was, how are residents shifting their behavior to online, or how are they adjusting their online behavior?
Yeah, how are they I guess both, how are they going online, if they're doing that more, and if they are, like, what are some of the tools that they're using to better connect to city services and their leadership?
So I don't have much to say on kind of how residents themselves are changing. I think what we're doing at the city is actually shifting much more to analog. We continue, of course, to kind of, like every city, develop new digital tools. Our 311 system continuously tries to improve, but we are seeing just the profound kind of breaking of the fabric, if not the social contract in Chicago. And that's not something you call 311 for. And so, or at least I've yet to see those calls. That would be kind of an interesting thing to capture on script. So we are instead really looking at, I think, frankly, more of the active listening approach of how do we get out, directly engage with residents. How can the mayor herself, but also our team, partner with intermediaries who have real currency and credibility in communities to kind of hear the pain points? How can we ask the right questions, or at least questions that are closer to the right ones, to get at where the real pain is and the real need is? And so a lot of that is hard organizing work that our previous two mayors over the last 30 years did not invest a ton in. And so this mayor and her team have spent a lot of time building effectively social capital between and among residents and city governments. That is by nowhere near a complete project, but something that we've seen the need to really focus on in the last couple months. We have a racial justice agenda here that is expressly about just giving voice to the inequities, structural, and also just the kind of the visceral suffering and fear that kind of structural racism has created and its consequences. And so that process was underway since a year ago when we took office, but we have doubled down on that, and so have a team called the Racial Equity Impact Teams that are out particularly in our, because we're so segregated, what we can say are effectively Black and brown neighborhoods, to actually hear from folks on, are you getting food? If you're not, what can we do? Do you have internet in order to stay connected to our Chicago public schools while they're closed for in-person learning? The kind of basic city services that otherwise would already be tenuous, we know have been cut off for seniors. We know they're not hopping online, generally speaking. And so what can we do to with AARP and other advocates, really reach them in a meaningful way that allows them to feel safe and comfortable and get the resources they need, even if it's short term. And then for the long term work, we are, this is the project of government, is how can we create meaningful networks that allow for people to tell us what they need, for us to respond via budget, but also via real community dialogue, and for us to have a collaborative project to transform how we're investing in and supporting residents. I won't even pretend to say that's anywhere near complete. I mean, that's just that is inching along as things are, but vitally important.
Thank you, Dan. Noel, Chelsea, I'd love to hear some of your thoughts on some of the comments Dan has made. I was really struck by his focus on it's not really so much people turning online as that we still have to maintain these analog networks, which is something that we also found in our research as well. So I'd love to just hear from either of you about are people shifting online? Are they shifting digital? Or are these analog networks still very important, even in a time of a pandemic, to maintain a robust community engagement?
Sure, I can speak a little bit to the ways that we've seen new kinds of online behaviors. A lot of our work with New York City public agencies has been really transformed because the city made a big commitment to distribute cell network enabled tablets to more than 250,000 New York City school children, so that kids could still engage in remote learning even if their family didn't have a networked device at home. What's been fascinating about that is not only did those tablets enable online learning, they also created new portals for other kinds of social service delivery. So we're hearing from a bunch of different social service delivery agencies about how they can actually now reach folks that they couldn't reach before because people have new ways of being able to get online from home. And a lot of desire on the part of social service providers to be able to continue to use those channels even post-pandemic. I think another thing that's happening that's very interesting is the way in which a whole set of regulations and requirements around the necessity of in-person appearances, those requirements are being relaxed or even abolished because of concerns around public health. But in fact, those requirements were always there to make service access difficult in contexts where there was more demand than there was government resource or government allocation of resource. There's plenty of government resource. Of course, the question is how it's allocated. There are choke points put in place. There are ways in which getting access to critical services is made more challenging. And in the context of the epidemic, a number of different public agencies on the state and the city level have said, we're going to just relax those requirements. We're not going to make people come for in-person appointments. We're going to allow people to call in. We're going to make it so you don't have to do that interview before you get food stamps, for example. So one thing that we're seeing, which is really interesting, is now some of our agency partners beginning to try to capture and codify what all of those regulatory changes were, and begin to advocate for maintaining some of those regulatory changes even after the point where the epidemic recedes.
Fascinating. Thank you. Well, I mean, do you have anything to add to this question?
Yeah, I think thanks, Chelsea, for saying all those things, because that's exactly what we spent the first few weeks of the COVID crisis on. We exclusively focused on continuity of government operations within community boards, borough presidents, and helping city council members facilitate more or less community town halls to keep people informed as everyone was told to shelter in place. It was quite remarkable to see how the city was not ready to take upon the challenge of digital communication at a broad scale other than email, Twitter, and Facebook. And so the standing up, the finding the practice or the platform, developing a practice, developing some good practices, doing some rapid iteration around helping community-based organizations like community boards or elected officials kind of get out the door and saying, okay, this is how you run an online meeting. And here's kind of like the tiered structure of that communication. Was instrumental. What we have now, people feared that the digital divide would essentially prevent people from participating in these large-scale digital town halls. But what we discovered is that when community boards in Manhattan really embraced kind of the full spectrum of digital engagement, from doing Zoom to then making sure that the telephone number was appropriate, that there was easy ways for people to engage, is that they saw engagement skyrocket. Community boards for the first time were almost having 100% attendance. When we were talking to the community board members of whether or not this is something that should be invested in and whether or not we should spend political capital to modify the open meetings law and the public officers law so that way these types of communications could be in place for the future, they said yes, because there are times where I can't make it. I don't have childcare. There are times where I'm sick, or community board members were saying I'm pregnant or I'm dealing with someone who is pregnant. Like I need to be able to engage in this civic sphere in using the digital tools that are available. And so as Chelsea echoed, or as Chelsea said, I want to echo, which is that this is a unique opportunity for us to look at what are the laws and rules that are in place that will enable us to have a multi-platform democracy and civic engagement that still lives up to the ideals of a proper, open, and accountable democracy or government.
Thank you for those comments, Noel. All right, so I want to also talk about transparency, and it's very important that city leaders have shown to show transparency with their residents about how they can be involved in decision making. And in some of our research, especially focused on our digital inclusion work, was discussed from our research. And so, Noel, I want to pose this question to you. I was really interested in your Beta NYC's work with really pushing New York City to release their coronavirus health portal. So I want to just kind of pose this question to you first about how cities are trying to be transparent with residents and how they're doing so. What are some examples in terms of how they're doing that well? But also, what do you see are areas of improvement in the space?
Those are big, broad questions. I will focus on, we called for, so the crisis that we've just gone through is a testament to surveillance technology. And we have now seen how surveillance technology is well equipped when it comes down to public safety, but hasn't always been well equipped when it comes to public health. And so early on in the corona pandemic, what we discovered is that the city didn't have a unified process to release where infections and where test positives and hospitalizations were happening in relationship to the demographics of the individuals. New York City stands unique in the way that they're one of the few municipalities that actually laid out that demographic information once it started collecting it, and hopefully set out a national precedent that will really help us understand what are the systematic injustices and how our healthcare system is racist by essentially releasing this data. What we called for was the nuanced breakdown of various levels of testing, various levels of infection, various levels of hospitalization, broken down to something called the NTA, which is the neighborhood tabulation area, which is a subsection of census block groups, which in a dense urban environment is more useful in understanding than if you were to use the zip code. Zip codes are great when you're looking at large swaths of territory, but in dense urban environments, those pieces of data literally break down. You cannot see the granularity of the census blocks that have different types of ethnic communities that are within it. And so, what we called for is an iterative process, which is we want the data to be shared. We want to use the data as a point of inflection and then conversation on how we can address a number of different issues. And we want to figure out how the data sharing process is an iterative process. So we're collecting more information, we're sharing more information, and that's helping us inform how do we then respond politically, service-wise, as well as just administratively.
Oh, great. Thank you for that, Noel. Chelsea, I want to also put this question to you and hear some of your thoughts on transparency.
Was that to me?
Oh, to Chelsea.
Oh, sorry.
But Dan, if you have something to say, go for it.
Yeah,
No, please go ahead.
Yeah.
It's interesting for our organization because we are often collaborating closely with policymakers and being outside of government and working with government. We often actually find ourselves in a place where we're bound by all kinds of legal restrictions on our ability to share the research and outcomes of the work that we do with cities. I'm hoping that this is a relatively wonky crowd of people who are on this call, so I can delve a tiny bit into like some legal issues around transparency, around the ways that even when government is engaged in public consultation processes, if they are doing that work with outside entities, often there is a requirement that none of the data or findings be publicly released, even though they're being done in a public interest way and using public money. So there are some real barriers, there's some real mindset shifts that we are often advocating for, where we are saying to our partners, hey, we're going to be doing community-based research with community members. We'd like to share the outcomes of that publicly all the way along the way. We'd like to be able to say all the way along the way, this is what we're finding. We want to return what we're learning to community members and to frontline providers with whom we're working. We want to be able to say publicly through all the channels, here are the things we're learning and discovering. Here's how we're thinking of moving forward with the things that we're hearing. But typically there are pretty stringent legal restrictions around that occurring. So there's an interesting, besides like post facto release of data, there's an interesting set of new models that need to be adopted around how work in progress can be talked about while it's in progress, while still addressing government's real concerns and anxieties around being perceived to be making mistakes or not knowing things. We want government to be able to be more flexible and iterative and responsive, and yet government also gets deeply punished for not knowing or being in error. And we have to be able to recognize when we don't know, and we have to be able to make errors in order to learn from them. So there's something about this tension between what a knowledge-seeking process is, what a true engagement process is, and the risks to government about being open about the need to learn.
Fascinating. Thank you, Chelsea. All right, Dan, I'd love to hear your thoughts as well, if you'd like to talk about transparency and how you're approaching this in your role in Chicago.
I'm not quite, could you give me a little more of a kind of frame that you'd like me to respond to?
Yeah, sure. So when I talk about transparency, Chelsea just kind of gave some good comments on that. And it's about our city leaders able to, do residents feel like their city leaders when they're engaging them are providing them with all the information they need to make an informed decision. And of course, there may be some legal implications as well in that. So I think from your point being the chief of policy, you have to balance, well, what can we share with our residents to make sure that they're being informed about the programs and policies that we are passing, but also, there are some things that you aren't able to share due to other considerations. So kind of wanted to have you share some thoughts, working within the government on how you tackle this question, but also ensure that, you are actively engaging your residents, providing with information that they need to make a decision for their communities. That makes more sense?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, there's a lot to say here, but I think generally, I guess I'd look at it through the lens of data. There's a bunch of ways we practice transparency, but just in COVID context, I think requiring and then putting out the public health data around the racialized impacts of COVID is something I think that we saw as an imperative. And so I think our instinct in city government here is to share the data first and let the kind of problem, especially our public health department, kind of the problem be clear, and then also level set on what resources and what kind of political capital we have to spend to fix that problem, but view those as two separate projects. And so problem would be the first, identifying and sharing the kind of the fundamental facts, the data, and then scoping out, pushing, seeing what's possible in terms of addressing that problem will be second. I think the work that Eric has been helpful on us on our kind of anti-poverty economic hardship work, we are clearly not going to, as a municipality in 2020, solve poverty, but being very clear about the problem as it actually is manifested and actually experienced versus the myths we tell ourselves is, I think, kind of a very important project for government to undertake right now.
Mm-hmm. All right, thank you, Dana. I really appreciate those comments. All right, so I wanted to then shift to this idea of understanding it and measuring, quote unquote, how cities are engaging their residents. And one of in our discussion with some of our panelists before, I mentioned this idea of metrics, but that may not be the way that we should describe it. It's like so basically I wanted to get a sense from the panelists about, specifically you, Chelsea, and I want to start with you on this question is, gleaming from your experience with leading the public policy lab, how do you help cities understand how well they're engaging their residents? And as you've said before in our previous discussions, it may not be a measure of metrics, but other ways of saying, okay, we are actually reaching our residents, we are connecting with them, we're helping cities impact, the decisions and helping them to understand what they're looking at. So can you talk a little bit about how cities can say, okay, we're actually reaching out to the people that we need to reach out in a very effective way? I'd love to hear some of your thoughts on that.
So I'm a qualitative researcher, so I should say that, and my colleagues are also. So we're mainly interested in messy questions and messy answers, which get to why people think or do things, or speak to people's imaginings and aspirations, more than we are interested in saying 72% of residents did this thing, or to even get to your specific question around how would you measure whether a city is engaging with residents. You could say 1,000 people came to this community forum, but that would actually tell you nothing about whether or not that participation in the community forum felt useful or meaningful, or whether people perceived that their interests and concerns were being taken seriously, or whether all of those 1,000 people were actually just reading their phone while they were sitting there. Like the question of measuring numbers I would argue, is only useful in as much as you also have access to information about what people think and feel and the whys associated with the context of those numbers. There's a great term that some ethnographers use and others who have been thinking about this kind of idea of big data and saying what we need more than just big data is thick data. Data which is rich with contextual information about people's experience. So I would say that our efforts with our agency partners tend to not be so much around saying, oh, can we quantify that we spoke with X number of people for X number of hours? I mean, we can do that, and we do. We say, you know, this process involved 200 hours of community-based research. But that's not the point. The point is not to say that we were there for 200 hours. The point is, in fact, to identify meaningful insights about people's current lived experience and use that as fuel to transform policymaking and service delivery in the future. And that doesn't come from a measurement of whether engagement occurred, but rather comes from a deeper understanding and documentation of what are the outcomes of having done those engagement processes.
If I could just jump in, that's my answer too. I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Dan. Exactly what. Definitely appreciate that. So let's talk about, and we kind of addressed this a little bit before, but I wanted to just expound on this. Cities must adapt and shift strategies continually in order to reach as many residents as possible, especially to those who have historically had inequitable accesses to services. And so, Dan, I wanted to pose a question to you, and really, again, talk about specific examples within the city of Chicago to help better connect residents with services.
I guess I would drop the qualifier of historical. I think it's quite present, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm.
I can just talk about water. It's something we're dealing with now. There are households in Chicago that are Chicago has a city-owned water utility. Obviously, we're on the shores of Lake Michigan. We have kind of some of the world's greatest, highest quality fresh water. And there are people in Chicago who do not have access to water in their homes. The mayor has kind of seized on this as frankly, a human rights violation and a problem. And so we are trying to figure out how to, and we have terrible data around who's connected, who isn't. There's lead service line challenges from a legacy city that many kind of cities east of the Mississippi have. We have a whole host of kind of water access, water cost, the water quality related issues that are without a doubt concentrated in mostly Black neighborhoods, in fact, Black neighborhoods. And so we have to do both the hard work of actually reconnecting them to water, those homes that are shut off, identifying folks who are quote unquote water insecure, people who are have access to water, but or have the connection, but are unable to afford in any given month water because of the cost of every other essential service, rent, food, childcare, electric, phone, all the other utilities. And so we, on the kind of fundamental connection, the mayor has said, I want no one to not be able to have water because of a lack of ability to pay. And so we are kind of pursuing that project, which sadly is a project. But at the same time, how do we deal with the folks who are, in theory, have access, but in fact are struggling to do that, or to have to juggle essential services and say, well, this month I will not pay my electric bill so I can pay my water bill. And so we created a kind of I think a pretty innovative approach to just heavily subsidize based on a number of kind of federal programs, including SNAP, that would allow us to kind of basically automatically enroll and qualify folks who should be eligible for assistance to have their water bills subsidized by the city and in some cases by the federal government. So we take it and it's a all layers of the problem approach. It's a data problem. It's clearly kind of a physical connection and a service delivery problem. It is a policy problem. It is a legacy challenge around infrastructure and race and And I guess we can call it environmental justice to be euphemistic about it. And so that's to us a good example of where service delivery is not just about the kind of the app on the phone or the ability to pick up the phone or design new programs, but it's about the core day-to-day work of, can you literally survive in your home? And of course, in the winter here, heat is another challenge. In the summer, cool is a challenge. Internet is something we're doing a lot of work around internet. So we're kind of tackling it from a bunch of different angles, but that kind of the ability to just make it through a season here is something that we take very seriously.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Dan. Appreciate your thoughts on that. And kind of the next question kind of extends to what we talked about earlier, which is about engagement and education and making sure that people who are involved in community engagement and the residents who are learning about the programs understand the data that informs how cities are making decisions. No, I'd like to really push this question to you. And doing some research on Beta NYC, one of the programs that you offer is a suite of open data classes. And I was really curious to learn more about how your classes help the general population learn about data and how has that impacted the way residents engage their city leaders. So I'll turn it over to you, Noel.
Yeah, thanks. So when we joined then City Council member Gail Brewer for the creation of the city's open data law, we stood with advocates, what I would call blue hair advocates, organizations that had been part of the progressive era movement calling for government transparency, accountability, and the progressive era's arguments, the good arguments from the progressive era, because there were some bad ones. I want to make sure that we call that out. Not everything from the progressive era was good, was the fact that if you had a populace that was literate and engaged in kind of communication technology, then newspapers, that they would then be able to hold government accountable, get rid of graft, get rid of nepotism, and have a more inclusive government. This was the era of Tammany Hall when New York City's first progressive pieces of legislation were passed that created what we call the City Record, which is a newspaper that's been published every single day that has a listing of events, procurement decisions, hirings, firings, salary changes. If you're a nerd like I am, it's the city's change log. It is the documentation of what is going on within city government. And so just as our foremothers and forefathers fought for the city record, we joined Gail Brewer in asking for the city's data to be essentially digitized. Our older brothers and sisters, aunts and uncles and parents had already fought for a piece of legislation in 1989 that helped put digitized information accessible in the city's library, but we wanted it online. And once we got it online, we realized that, it is in the language of government. And the language of government itself is the language of a number of different enterprises based upon, what is government either overseeing or providing services on. So there's the language of education and government. There's the language of budget and government, law enforcement, transportation, et cetera. And when we started looking at the data, we literally were like, how do we figure this out? So Beta NYC saw a unique opportunity to help create a curriculum and classes around the city's open data portal, a platform, and data itself to help demystify what was that government information. When you're dealing with digitized data, you sometimes see data in an abstract. So a borough gets turned into a 2-digit code. A street actually gets turned into a lat long or like some numerical value. there's some abstract expression for actually what the service code of the 311 request is. And so we felt it was super important to make sure that that information was accessible to everyone in a decoded way. So our classes we have a broad swath of classes. Our educational material reaches from middle school to senior citizens. We've created our classes and heavily inspired by our friends in Detroit at AMP, Allied Media Programs, to make sure that when you could attend our classes, that they were physical. And so we have a physical computing mechanism that demystifies how to do pivot, sort, group, count. In our classes, we end up taking you on literally a data journey. So we introduce you to the core terms that you will need to know over and over and over when you start playing with the data. We then teach you the data systems and then how to string together a number of data systems, because once again, these tools are not meant for the general public to hold government accountable. They're meant for government to run government and to hold the agencies in the implementation of those services. Our classes are broken up into 4 primary classes with an actual 201, which is a train the trainers. We've educated thousands of New Yorkers. We run the Hack League, which is an academic competition with the Department of Education. So that way middle school and high school students get access to government data, and then they can see themselves reflected in that data, and then are able to use their computer science principles to express their interest in the problems that they want to solve. And then last year, we pioneered a program with the Queens Public Library where we educated about 20 volunteers to go to every single community board across the borough of Queens, which is the most diverse county in the United States, to educate 300 New Yorkers on essentially what are these data tools that were out there. So we created a bunch of more or less reference librarians around open data. We see this as an opportunity to really make sure that people understand that when they want to engage in the civics, that the information of the civics that they're engaging in is online, and that is easily accessible for free 24 hours a day without a copyright. So yeah, that's a little bit about the classes that we've developed here in New York.
Thank you for sharing that. No, I mean, yeah, when I had a chance to take a really look at some of the information, I was just really fascinated to understand, again, how you connect people to data, because, it can be very much an abstract concept. It's like, how do I take all this data and understand it in a way that makes sense to me? And when you're able to, bridge that gap, I mean, it really opens doors for many people. So I just found that fascinating. So, Ben,
Can I also add, sorry, our classes are online, so beta.nyc/classes. Everything is Creative Commons under attribution. We want to see, have been funded by the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation to get this type of material out there. If you are in a municipality and you need help creating curriculum, we want to see that curriculum developed. It's free online. Take it, reference it, and contact us if you have any questions.
Thank you, Noel. Really appreciate it. Okay, let's go to some questions. So the first question is, where are the politicians in this conversation? Is there a constituency or the voters electing them as their agents through this technology of engaging residents? And do our residents have access? Chelsea, let me pose that question to you, and then Dan, I'd like to get your thoughts as well.
Sure. So I should say that our primary partnerships are with executive agencies, so with folks who are essentially charged with operationalizing policy decisions that get made by elected officials, whether legislative or executive. I think there's an interesting thing about how politicians, I think, believe that they already hear from their constituents. Politicians, in fact, are in the business of constituent engagement. One could question whether or not, however, the types of engagement that that they do with constituents actually leads to good and appropriate policy decisions. And then secondarily, I think that executive agencies often have very rigid and high walls around how they engage with members of the public in the course of operationalizing policy. And that's a space where we work quite hard to try to develop ways for people in those kind of executive leadership roles at public agencies and their operational leaders to do more substantive engagement with human beings who are being affected by their policy and operational decisions. I think that but that often occurs without there particularly being a charge from politicians that agencies should do that.
Interesting. Thank you. Our next question.
I mean, Dan might contest that.
Yeah, Dan, if you want to. Yeah, you want to respond to Chelsea's comments?
I'm not quite sure I followed the last point.
Oh, from Chelsea?
Just that the role of constituent engagement is seen as one that's, I think, primarily, let's call it, owned by political actors, by elected officials. But the folks who are actually operationalizing policy decisions, who are not elected officials or appointed officials or who are civil servants, the ability of those folks to actually do substantive engagement around policy and operational decisions is often pretty limited or pretty constrained. And there's not necessarily a huge charge from elected officials to the people who operationalize city services and city policies to do deeper community-based work.
Let's have Dan and then no. Dan?
I think that's generally true. I guess I'd say I would not want to put civil servants in the position, though, of being accountable in the way that elected officials are. I think there is a fundamental difference that allows for some helpful installation. It obviously can be done in a way that is too severe and allows for people to be unaccountable. That would be too far. But I would hesitate to say that I'd want every civil servant in Chicago or head of a program to be similarly accountable the way an elected official is. I think that's a different level of accountability. But I take the point that, yeah, you want to have kind of the program leads, the civil servants, not be insulated politically in an extreme way.
No, did you have something to? I know it sounds like you wanted to share a comment as well.
Yeah. I think what both Chelsea and Dan are kind of highlighting, and particularly Chelsea's highlighting, which I want to echo, is that there are political government, essentially all of our governments I see this a lot of time when I'm working with agencies here in New York City. They have actually two sets of agencies. You have a political agency, and then you have more or less the civil service agency. And my friends who are in the civil service are there to execute, their belief and their profession, and ensure that services are administered as justly as possible under the rubric of the political administration. And the political administration changes, sometimes it changes for years, sometimes it changes even within administration, whether outside activists are able to make that call happen. And we do need to create a framework where civil servants are able to identify problems within service delivery, be able to say, I can make a suggestion to improve this process. I absolutely find stories of people hiding behind bureaucracy absolutely frustrating. I know that this isn't the case everywhere, because most civil servants are genuinely trying to solve and give people solutions to their problems. But the story of a mother who went to go get assistance for her child and to get childcare, only to end up sitting on the floor with her child, ultimately tased and arrested, is just absolutely absurd. There wasn't enough chairs for her to sit there, and someone decided that it was more appropriate to call the cops than just let her sit on the floor with her child
and spend hours so that way she could get the child care voucher, which she had been inappropriately removed from. I know that there are better ways to do government. I think, like whether you want to talk about lean or if you want to talk about agile, it's about changing the framework so that way civil servants can engage in a collective conversation about finding positive opportunities to improve. I'll leave it at that.
All right. Thank you, Noel. I can tell your passion. I love it. Thank you. We have no more limited time, so we have 2 more questions, and I'll just ask them both and then direct them to the appropriate panelists. So the first question, and I want to direct this to you, Chelsea, is given the lack of responsiveness of most elected officials due to the large and non-homogeneous constituencies they represent, are collections of interest groups the most efficient way to communicate? And will the elected officials understand the breadth of the representation under these groups? And then the second question, which I'll direct to you, Dan, is what are the bright spots around planning with vulnerable and marginalized communities while also being considerate of their time and resource limitations? So Chelsea, we'll direct the first question to you, and then Dan will give you the second question.
So can you just repeat? I think there were 2. There was a part A and a part B there. It was,
there was
are large interest groups the most effective way to influence the viewpoints of elected officials? And will elected officials understand that those interest groups may represent broad constituencies?
That's right. You paraphrase it well. Yeah.
I think that the necessity of advocacy by communities can't be contested. I mean, what we are seeing right now outside there are helicopters hovering over my house. The role of people taking to the streets, people engaged in protest, people signing letters. 200 current and former New York City employees have just sent an open letter to the mayor demanding changes to policing policy. The role of organizations that have strong political and even donor relationships with politicians, pressing politicians to change the way that they're behaving. The role of people who have power and influence. I see what's going on with now a series of generals coming forward and speaking about the role of the American military. Like, all of those things are absolutely critical and necessary. I don't want to agree, however, with the questioner's assertion that one of those things has to be most. I think that there is work to be done outside of institutions to push them to change in ways that we need them to change. I think there's also work to be done inside of political systems for those political systems to be more equitable and just. So I wouldn't want to pick one. I think both of those things have to happen. Organized interest groups have to push politicians to behave in new ways, and also inside of our systems of government, we have to learn new ways of doing government.
And then the second question about the bright spots around planning with vulnerable and marginalized communities and while being considerate of their time and resource limitations. I'd love to hear from you on that.
Bright spots. I'm not quite sure. I guess we're going to undertake our first comprehensive plan in 60 years in Chicago, and that will be done in collaboration with residents and community groups. So that's a bright spot. It's hard to. I'm not quite sure that frame doesn't. It's not quite how I think. I think it's the day-to-day work of government is to build to do that kind of work. But no one here in the city would pretend that work is complete and therefore kind of right in that way. But I think, we're out there doing it, and I think being held accountable. I think that's exactly right, that we need to be pushed. Absent those pushes, from everything from protest to more subtle pushback, we're not going to change. And so everything from here's the data that we don't yet see, or here's what it's looking like on the ground, to here are pain points that we need to act on to shift our sense of urgency. That's necessary work. So yeah, I think we're kind of, it's the day-to-day stuff that we're doing. There's not really there's no kind of wins in my book on that stuff.
Yeah, very apt. It's all about improvement and continuing to push forward. So thank you for those comments, Dan. I can tell we already had a lot of great questions, but unfortunately it's 1 o'clock and we want to make sure that we're cognizant of everybody's time. So just first I want to say thank you again to our panelists for sharing their expertise with us today. I know that their insights have truly helped us all to think about how we can be better in planning with and not for the communities that we engage in. And it's very important that we have true collaboration. So to close, again, just say thank you to our panelists. And tomorrow, please tune in at 12 p.m. for our final panel of the Equity Imperative, which is called Keeping Inclusive Innovation in a Focus During the Pandemic. This is a conversation that's going to be moderated by the president of the Urban Institute, Sarah Rosen-Wortel. In this session, we're going to welcome former mayor of the city of Philadelphia, Michael Nutter, and the founder and president of the Mastercard Center for Inclusive Growth, Shamina Singh. So I just want to again say thank you to everybody that attended this panel. As I hope that you got as much out of it as I did. I learned quite a lot about community engagement, and I think Chelsea, Dan, and Noel really gave some great insights to help us think about, again, how we can help plan with and not for our communities. So I wish everybody a great day. Thank you, and I hope to see you tomorrow. Take care.